Thank you so much, Caitlin, for joining us today for this conversation. If you could start by telling us a little bit about yourself and just your background, your work, and your research more generally.
Of course. So I have a background in media and communication research. I did a master's at Melbourne Uni, and there I started looking at the experiences of witnessing online harassment. So this was back about, I don't know, 8 years ago or something like that, where I thought, well, there's been a lot of research that's done about the impacts of harassment on people who experience it, but what about the people who just witness it? What happens to those people? Because we all see it every day on different platforms. And obviously, back then it was particularly focused on things like Facebook, where people were spending quite a lot of time. It was a time when Facebook was popular and popular with young-ish people, not just full of boomers, which is great, good for them. Happy that Facebook exists still. um so my interest has been in the kind of the experiences of online harassment and looking at that through a sort of feminist lens, really.
Awesome, thank you. Now I'd like to ask you, what does an ideal world or digital space look like for you? And is there anything that platforms or stakeholders that are currently doing that is good or can be improved upon?
So I forgot to mention that I also then went on and did a PhD and also worked for a not-for-profit called Gender Equity Victoria, where I looked at online harassment of women in the public eye. And in my PhD, I looked at women's everyday relationships with their smartphones. Um, so for me, an ideal world is really informed by the moving away from the kind of data extractive business models that have dominated the tech space. One of the things that I found constantly throughout my research and throughout my work is that this is a pervasive problem. And I think a lot of the issues can be traced back to those kinds of extractive models of gathering user data without any requirement for an opt-out or no requirement for consent. And I think that is the key, I think, to addressing a lot of the harms that we see online, because privacy is an enormous part of what makes being able to participate online feasible for lots of people. And there should be only very few circumstances where that privacy is breached, I think. And I think for me, that's really the underlying issue when it comes to online harm and online safety.
Great, thank you so much. And just, I know you said your research was on like women in the spotlight and also, people who witness abuse and harassment online. I wanted to get your thoughts about the experiences of marginalized communities as well. Particularly how their experiences of online harassment or abuse are compounded by their intersecting identities. And I know like an intersectional lens or intersectionality is quite a popular buzzword at the moment, but what does that actually mean in practice if we were to apply that kind of approach?
That's a really good and very difficult question, I think, to answer, because I think um, if we think about intersectionality as being about the experience of the world, or sort of experiencing the world through sort of like what Patricia Hill Collins calls the sort of matrix of oppressions, we actually can't, I think, disentangle a neoliberal capitalist agenda from that matrix. And so really, I think that intersectionality in practice looks like being led by the people from the margins, being led by the communities from who are experiencing the very worst of the internet, to sort of use, I guess, the examples that we're talking about today. But I think that is the key, is that you need to be led by the ideas, by the wants, by the needs of the people who are most affected. And that is, I think, overwhelmingly those people from those communities are saying the same, very similar sorts of things, which is that they are over surveilled, they are over policed, and that spills over into online spaces as well, where it's not just that their data is surveilled, but their behaviors are surveilled, and who they are is surveilled, how they express themselves, and that actually we need to be led by those communities really when we're thinking about solutions.
I think you made a great point there. So thank you, Caitlin. The question that I have is based on your research. So we know that women in leadership and women in high profile positions face a disproportionate amount of abuse online. What about this visibility impacts their experience of online violence? And is there any measures that can be placed in digital spaces, whether it's accountability from stakeholders, whether it's governments or regulators or the tech platforms themselves, that can be put in place to help these women better?
So if I go to the first part of your question, how does visibility impact their experience of women's experiences of online violence? I think that for some people, seeing women being in positions of leadership is still seen as unusual or unexpected or unacceptable in some way, and I think a lot of it is to do with gender inequality, that we don't have a lot of social acceptance or cultural acceptance of women in leadership positions, and that misogyny and sexism is still really prevalent and really well tolerated by lots of people, even if they don't want to admit it. So I think that part of it is to do with a lack of acceptance, because women have been in leadership positions for decades. It's not something this isn't a new phenomenon of women being in leadership. It's not something that sort of suddenly emerged. This is something that it has existed for a really long time, but it is still for some people really unacceptable. And in terms of what measures can be put in place, I think that there's several things. So first of all, obviously that sort of like addressing gender inequality will then lead to more acceptance around women in leadership positions, which is great. But that can't be the kind of the be all and end all. We also need things like accountability, like you were saying, on different levels of government, in different industries, at a sort of platform level as well, that platforms need to enforce their own community standards, essentially, which is the same thing that people have been saying for decades, that the problem is that these community standards exist, but they're just not enforced, they're not implemented. And for the people who are on the receiving end of this, it's extremely frustrating, because what they're saying as well is that things like gendered abuse of, say, transgender people is then not recognized by the platform as being abusive, or not recognized as being in contravention of their community guidelines. And so that's what I mean when I'm sort of talking about, I guess, as well, being led by the margins, because there is this is coming from those communities saying this is a problem, but it's not being sort of actioned in a realistic way. And like I was saying at the beginning, I think the privacy reform is a huge part of this problem as well, to kind of ensure that companies that operate in Australia have that social license to operate, so that they are working with our sort of legislation. They are respecting the privacy of people that live here. They're respecting the privacy of children that use these platforms. I'm really not a big fan of the social media ban, because I think it's really short-sighted, and I don't think it does enough to address the actual harms that are taking place online. But I think that we need to be thinking about this as a collective problem. So this isn't something that is just an issue for women to solve necessarily. This is something that we all have a responsibility to be looking at, because I think this is one of the criticisms of the sort of prevention effort, right, is that it's so often it's being driven by women talking to other women about the problem of men's violence online, or men's violence in general, but men's violence online in this example. And actually we need more collective movement. We need to work collaboratively and not in isolation, I guess.
Yeah, that was like I have the same views definitely about how we all need to like work together. It's no, one quick fix or silver bullet
Right.
that will address this problem at all. I had a bit of a different kind of question on that. Do you feel like there is more awareness compared to maybe when, you said you started this research 8 years ago? Since then, have we started talking about it more? Or is there, more of a focus on community-based approaches, on letting marginalized communities potentially lead or have some input? Or is there still a long way to go? If we're speaking about Australia specifically, or any other countries, really.
I think there's been sort of a certain level of increased awareness, I suppose, and at the same time, I think that we haven't. I don't think there has been enough effort made to listen to any of the research that's come out of particularly, especially marginalized communities. We just haven't. That hasn't been listened to. That hasn't been taken on board. That hasn't been implemented. And it's something that we see over and over and over again. I think Australia is a really peculiar place because we just love an inquiry. We love to ask questions and then just completely ignore the answers. And that, I think, is really holding us back from making any real change, because if we just keep asking questions and ignoring the answers, like, what are we doing? Why are we doing that? It doesn't actually improve the lives of anybody, really. And I think we see this playing out again and again in online spaces as well. There have been so many public and parliamentary inquiries into the harms of social media, into the harms of digital platforms, and the recommendations get put out, and then they're interesting and newsworthy for a few days, maybe a day, and then they disappear. And I think the problem is that the people who are most affected by online harm have been saying what the solutions are for ages, and they are just not listened to at particular levels. So I think we need to stop having royal commissions and inquiries into these things and actually start listening and reading the findings and reading the recommendations that are coming out of them.
And that's a very, very good point. Thank you, Caitlin. My question for you is in that same vein. There are a lot of people who are bystanders, and you mentioned this, bystanders of online abuse and harassment. And they might not necessarily feel like they have a responsibility to creating a safer digital space, even though they continue to engage with the platforms every single day. They might not be victim survivors of the abuse themselves, but they are witness to it. What is your advice on perhaps taking accountability or understanding what your responsibilities are with interacting with technologies every single day, and perhaps being witness to online abuse and harassment, even though it might not be your direct family or your friend, but it might be a stranger online, it might be a politician, might be a celebrity, might be someone in a high profile position. Do you have any advice for that, or has any of your research shed light on bystander experiences and accountability?
Yeah, definitely. So I've done some work around active online bystanding. And I think it's a really interesting space because, as with many of these things, there is no sort of silver bullet that you can tell people to do, and it will make everything feel better. So I think, first of all, that to be affected by witnessing abusive behavior in any situation is perfectly reasonable. There's nothing unusual about witnessing something abusive and then feeling affected by it. That's quite normal. And then the second thing is that only intervene or only step in if you feel like you can. I think that's really, really important, because if you feel comfortable, if you feel maybe not comfortable, because I think sometimes doing things like this is sort of there's always a degree of discomfort, but doing things that aren't going to put yourself in harm's way. So whether that's direct messaging somebody and saying, I saw that thing that this person said, and I think it was terrible, and I think that you don't deserve to be spoken to like that, or reporting comments that you see that, and this happens a lot online, that things will get circulated where people say, can people go and report this post? Can people go and report this comment because they're making derogatory statements about people of color or trans people or whoever it is? And can we mobilize collectively to go and try and take this rhetoric offline? And I think those things are really important and really useful. And I think the other thing is if you can't intervene in those ways sort of directly, to advocate for privacy reform, advocate for more effective regulation of digital platforms and for their uses of user data. Like, those things are enormously important and are highly instrumental in creating safer digital spaces. That the problem of online harassment is that these businesses have operated for like 2 decades now on these extractive data systems that incentivize engagement, that incentivize outrage, that incentivize people sort of the most extreme views. And that has driven, I think, that has driven a lot of what we're seeing in terms of the exacerbation of online harassment. So advocating for reform is a huge part of it, because I think that we can't, I don't think we can ban our way out of this problem. I don't think that we can have a solution that relies on a real name internet or further invasions of people's privacy, like, that you need to upload ID or something to use a social media platform. I don't know that that's the solution, because what I've seen in my research is that when I've spoken to women in positions of influence or leadership, they will say, you would not believe the stuff that some of these people will happily say to me with their real name and their occupation and their employer. And it's not that people need to be disincentivized from making these comments, because they're doing it. They're not doing it through anonymous accounts. That's not where it's happening. It's happening sometimes through anonymous accounts, but also through people who are using their real name and their workplace on their profile. And that, I think, indicates that this is much more of a social problem that is then intertwined with digital business models or platform business models that we haven't addressed.
And that's an excellent point to end on. So thank you so much, Caitlin, for all your insight and really, really important research and work that you're doing. So keep up the great work. And thank you so much for your time as well. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.